I was prompted to check out the GTX 750 Ti by one of your comments back in May, asking how I was able to run Apex Legends on the GTX 760. This then got me thinking, how well does a DirectX 11 card, still supported by the latest drivers, manages to play games these days, when support for DirectX 11 is dwindling? You see, despite the GTX 750 Ti being on the Maxwell architecture, it only supported DirectX feature level 11, just like the Kepler cards from the 700 series. It was the Maxwell refresh, aka the 900 series, that added support for feature level 12. For what is worth though, even the first generation Maxwell cards, like the 750 Ti, enjoy the improved power efficiency from that architecture, making them one of the most power efficient GPUs for the 28nm lithography. In the case of the 750 Ti, the listed TDP is 60 watts. And if that's not enough to make the 6-pin power connector laughable, I'll have you know that I didn't see my sample reporting more than 30-something watts consumed. As expected for this level of power consumption, the cooling solution selected is your classical Intel stock cooler-like aluminum floor with a single fan. This is more than enough to keep this card cool, and in a full load the card struggles to reach 64C for a delta over ambient of 39 degrees. Now, the card was used a lot to turn office PCs into entry-level gaming machines. However, we'll be using the Ryzen 5 3600 PC to run our tests with 32GB of DDR4 in dual channel at 3000 MHz. But if it's any comfort, the PC does look a bit like a workstation. As for the gaming results, the painful results first. Apex Legends, Rainbow Six Siege, Marvel Rivals, and Robocop failed to launch. Doom Eternal did launch, but the game crashed to the desktop during the benchmark run. Cyberpunk 2077 will run an average FPS in the mid-30s at 720 resolution and the built-in low settings profile. This also means that FSR is enabled and on auto, but even so, the 1% lows stayed in the low 20s. I can see people that already have a 750 Ti giving this game a go, but I would not buy one just to play Cyberpunk. The finals managed 52 FPS on average during an online match at 720 resolution and low settings. The 1% lows managed 40 FPS. Fine if you're a casual player, pretty bad if you're a bit more competitive. I also did run in the quick cache tutorial. The performance numbers were close, so I can now test lower performing hardware without ruining the game for my teammates. Fortnite managed to stay playable at all 3 tested resolutions. I used the performance rendering mode and a draw distance set to far. Everything else was left at low settings. The average FPS ranges between 106 at 1080 resolution and 186 at 720 resolution. The 1% low stayed well above 60, even at 1080 resolution, and reached 107 at 720. Terminator Resistance is an older single-player game, developed on Unreal Engine 4. 1080 resolution and high settings runs at 42 FPS on average on the 750 Ti. The 1% lows are under 30 FPS. I could play like that. However, 1080 resolution and medium settings gets the average at 54 FPS and the 1% lows at 41. So there's a compromise between medium and high settings, more closer to high, where the 1% low stays above 30 FPS. Online games with large communities like Counter-Strike 2 need to run well on cheap GPUs for those GPUs to be a viable option for budget gamers. Fortunately, the 750 Ti will have its 1% lows above 60 FPS at all tested resolutions. The average FPS ranges between 115 and 139, depending on the resolution. Low settings was not low enough to get Far Cry 6 to run at 30 FPS for the 1% lows at 1080 resolution. To be honest, even the 1600x900 results don't look that good. The average FPS of 33 is fine on its own, but a bad omen for the 1% lows. Those landed at 28. The game becomes playable at 47 FPS for the average and 39 for the 1% lows, if you can tolerate a decreased resolution to 1280x720. Control is playable at 720 resolution and stock low settings. The GTX 750 Ti averaged 42 FPS and ran a 1% lows number of 31. Now, not all options are at their minimum at low settings, so manually turning every option to their lowest increases these two numbers to 53 and 38 respectively. Overwatch 2 is very friendly with low-performing hardware. Even the GTX 750 Ti can average above 100 FPS at 1080 resolution and low settings. Lowering the resolution increases the FPS proportionally with the reduction in pixel count, and the average reaches 212 FPS at 720 resolution. The 1% low stays at about 80% of the average. The game plays just fine. I was hoping I would be able to turn off FSR in Resident Evil 4. Unfortunately, at 720 resolution and prioritized performance with FSR manually turned off, the GTX 750 Ti doesn't get the 1% loss above 30 FPS, and with the average at 35, the experience is choppy. The stock prioritized performance profile, however, comes with FSR turned on, and in this case the average gets up to 54 FPS and the 1% lows at 29. Better, but really just borderline playable. Dota 2 is typically CPU bound at 1080 resolution and low settings. This was also the case with the GTX 750 Ti, so the average of 128 FPS should come as no surprise. The 1% lows is shy of 70 FPS, and the 0.1% is in the low 30s. Out of all resolutions and quality settings combinations tested for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 1600x900 and low settings is the most appealing for me. The GTX 750 Ti manages to keep the 1% loss above 30 FPS, and the average FPS gets close to 15. The only way to keep the 1% loss above 30 when increasing the quality from lowest to low is to drop the resolution to 720. I for one prefer a higher pixel count instead of prettier ones. Borderlands 3 is playable at 1080 resolution but only at very low settings. As quality increases to low, the resolution needs to be dropped to 1600x900 to be able to keep the 1% loss above 30 FPS. The average FPS is 40 for this case and 42 for the second. It's a pity to see a video card that still has enough power to run some of the current games to be left out due to API incompatibilities. With more and more games dropping DirectX 11, this then makes the former legend less and less attractive. And while the amount of people in my county crying over Robocop or Doom Eternal will not be enough to fill my local shawarma place, the community for Apex Legends or Marvel Rivals is significantly larger. And now 750 Ti users are locked out from some of those communities. Who's to blame here? NVidia for making sure to bake in some planned obsolescence when it decided to not support DirectX 12 with its first generation Maxwell cards? Game developers who decided that the best way to save a buck is to drop support for DirectX 11 and have the programmers either move to other teams or worse? Everybody wants to make a buck, and that's fair. And while today this seems more and more like a war being waged against us consumers, the roots of this were always there. And judging by the prices for this card, sometimes up to 30 USD, it seems that this is true even when it comes to the used parts market. My suggestion is to not pay more than 15 for it, and buy it only if you play older games. Think Fortnite, CS2, Overwatch 2, or older single-player titles. I've linked another recent video covering the 750 Ti from Random Gaming in HD. He covered other games, so feel free to check it out. Anyway, this is it for the GTX 750 Ti. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it,